Okay. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the podcast this morning. I am joined today by not just an industry expert, but more of an industry legend, Tammi Morton. Tammi, your resume is just incredible in terms of what you've been involved in over the years. From your early days in the real NCIS, and then you worked for HP, United Technologies, Raytheon, United Healthcare. And these were all as, chief security officer. You were in charge of managing security and the well-being of hundreds of thousands of people. And now you've got your own business in terms of HaloPoint. It's an amazing resume. And so thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thank you, David. It's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
So we're in an interesting time, not only from a geopolitical sense and everything that's happening in supply chains, but also just in terms of the nature of the business and the things that have been, really driving an impact over the last couple of years. And, what we've seen in Overhaul is what we call the AI gold rush. So what we've seen is the hyperscalers are starting to build out at a massive scale, and this is all commonly available information. Microsoft have spent upwards of 80 billion. Meta probably somewhere close to that. Google has been spending absolutely incredible amounts of money building out this infrastructure for this next, if you like, iteration of technology, and that in itself it's amazing. I mean, it's an industry, if you think about it, that really wasn't there 5 years ago. So it's incredible that these companies have been able to pivot to do this. But also as this gold rush happens, as they start to build out this AI infrastructure, what happens to the security challenge when there's like these high value assets? They're not just high value, but they're also incredibly strategically sensitive. And right up until last week, even when we saw the issue with SMCI and the sale of chips to China, how does this just change the security protocol here?
Well, absolutely. It's in that race, that gold rush that you just mentioned, it is really about, competitive advantage and how can we get there faster than the next one to be more efficient, more effective, use it for decision making, using AI for decision making. And what I'm concerned about is, and as it's pivoted so quickly, I was seeing a new industry rise. Every time I turn around, there's some other capability that's been discovered or being leveraged that has some advantage in some way for a business or for security. And so as I look at that and it being strategic, it's it's really about how quickly a company can grow, but keep up with the governance that goes with it. That desire to be there first and to take advantage of it has to scale at a pace that the governance, the guardrails are put up because you put so much at risk. You have so much more risk now when it's a strategic part of how you do business. It is about business resilience, it's about business growth, it's about getting to market. But if you don't have those guardrails in place and you don't scale and you don't put the policy in place as you scale, you are opening yourself up to huge risk. I think the tolerance as we have to move more quickly, we have a more volatile market. We are trying to, frankly, the just globally how we do business and what the risks are have changed significantly just over the last few years.
Sure.
So recognizing that and saying, how do I get there quicker? But I'm also now exposing myself to more risk. And the more quick, the more intense speed and strategy start impacting what we're talking about today, how we incorporate AI, not only for a company, but for security. The tolerance for weakness, the tolerance for exposure, the consequences are much higher, and the tolerance is much more intense with regard to not being tolerant of mistakes made or exposures that weren't there before.
No, that makes sense. And like you've worked for some of the biggest companies in the world with some very sensitive technologies. Is there anything different, or where do you see the greatest risk in terms of, we would call it chain of custody. So, how do we make sure that this chain of custody for these incredibly important pieces as they flow through the supply chain, where are the real risks that you see there based on everything that you've worked on before?
Yeah, so I think the risks are typically where the handoffs are. So as I look at supply chain, and in my experience, supply chain was not owned by one entity; it was fragmented. Frankly, and the fragmentization and the handoff is where I believe the most risk occurs. So oftentimes, especially when speed is involved, I think companies or organizations may look and say, "Well, we have a process in place. We have it here on paper," and there are assumptions made with regard to as those handoffs occur that the process is being followed. Truly, I think, especially when we're using AI. We're also we're trusting that process and making assumptions. That's where the gaps and that's where the risk occurs. We don't know. We don't have eyes on. We don't have necessarily that visibility. Who's accountable at each of the handoffs? How are they being managed? Are they cutting corners? Are they actually following process? So verification of the process being used, and then as it's handed off, it could be to the vendor, it could be to procurement, it could be to logistics, it could be to to the site team. It's being handed off, and that consistency to process, that consistency to how we're following the process qualitatively, there's no eyes on, or it's difficult to verify. So that's, I think, the biggest risk with regard to that fragmentization. We don't know who has the handoffs, and is it being followed within the process that has been established. And there's always that pressure to go faster, maybe skip a step or two to get it to where it needs to go more quickly, so that again we have a strategic advantage.
So what role do the third parties play in this? So, to your point, the supply chains are reasonably fragmented, decentralized to a certain extent. What do the third parties play in this? Be they logistics providers or even security providers, and how does that roll back into the whole governance question? So, where does accountability start and stop? I suppose.
Right. So who has oversight over those vendors? Do we know and have we established who owns it? Right? Who owns it? So that accountability gets lost somewhere along the way. Knowing who our vendors are and who maybe even the sub vendors are, so that we understand who they are, that they are very clear with regard to what the process requires, and that there's some type of accountability that we can audit how they're managing those. Just having that dashboard and saying we did this process. Yep, I see it was handed off here and in this manner isn't enough. We need to have some type of verification process. We need to know our vendors. We need to understand, make sure they understand what those requirements are, and then that direct oversight, eyes on, needs to be established and verified.
It's really interesting because it is. I mean, it's one of the branches that our technology has really gone down over the last sort of 12 or 18 months is this concept of what we call fraud watch, and this is where we are getting down into that practical application of verifying driver at pickup, because that's exactly where you start to see the breakdown. To your point of even from a process perspective, you can have all of the different layers, but the governance of those processes is incredibly important, and you need to put in those checks and balances to ensure that your governance measures actually are effective, so to speak, through your supply chain. Am I thinking about that in the right way?
You're absolutely right, and I think it's establishing the fundamentals, like clear ownership, disciplined handoff of procedures, strong receiving controls, making sure those are locked in, vendor accountability, defined escalation paths. All of those things we need to put in place and have those vendors, those people who are touching it, that they're trained, they know what they're supposed to do, what they're expected to do, and that there's going to be oversight. And then you also have to have strong, cross communication, collaboration, and coordination. So it's not just when we become each of these processes belong to someone else, you have to have cross-functional coordination and accountability, or I should say communication, so that we know it's all working and that, well, my part worked just fine. Well, my part worked fine, but who's the view and the oversight of the entire process to verify that in fact it's working as is intended to.
No, I love that. So here's a question. You were chief security officer for several very big companies. But when you think about the cost of loss, so and again in overhaul in our industry in particular, we're continually having this conversation of a theft is not just a loss of value. There's a greater impact to the brand, to the company, to the customer, to all of those things. How did you have those conversations at the C-suite level? How did you have those conversations with the senior leadership?
It was, as things get measured again, you have those dashboards and you're looking across like, well, this got delivered, or, oh, we have a supply chain loss. We have an asset that got lost. Hey, and that cost us this much money or delayed. You have a conversation with regard to how is this enabling the business? What does this mean? So if I'm talking about the pharmaceutical or the healthcare industry, for instance, it's like, okay, so we had a loss of some pharmaceuticals, or somehow the supply chain process wasn't being followed correctly. You now have issues with regard to huge customer impact if in fact something gets through, or again, competitive advantage. Trying to get there quickly, or hey, the loss was this much, we have to overcome it. We have to, find a way to get it to market as quickly as possible. Now it's about business resilience. It's about brand. It's about integrity of our products and people's trust in our products and trust in the company itself and what processes we have in place. You can lose that and the strategy of that. If we have a gap, someone's going to fill the hole. And so in healthcare, you can imagine the customer impact if we've got pharmaceuticals there, but also in the aeronautical and defense industry. You think about the components that are coming over through the supply chain and the impact that that can have if there's something that goes wrong with regard to those components don't work properly when it gets to where it needs to go. It also can mean, having the strategy of the efficiency and effectiveness and trying to over leverage AI in the process. Again, unless you have that guardrail, you have those processes in place that are being verified and trained to and what have you, you just opened yourself up to huge risk if you have a failure. It's really about strategy. It's about business growth. It's about business enablement in ways that it never has been before.
I think that's a very interesting point in terms of it's not kind of like it's not another thing. It's not a sort of add-on to your supply chain. It actually has to be fully integrated into everything that you do because it's not just about the value loss of a specific theft. It's about, to your point, the value of trust. And that trust goes the whole way through your vendors, through your suppliers, through your customers, through your partners. That's where you start to really feel the pain. And I think that that's becoming more evident. And in this AI infrastructure piece in particular, it's even more so because it's the reputation of your entire company. If those particular pieces of equipment end up in the wrong hands of bad actors, that's going to be severely damaging to your reputation as much as anything else.
And trying to get ahead of that, I mean, it's not just about like, okay, we train our supply chain vendors or our supply chain function, it's a certain way. It's really it's about making sure our business leaders are aligned, that we know what that looks like and what the process is involved. You have to have alignment across all of it, not just the one function, and that understanding and that support and that infrastructure in place before you leverage it, even though there's a rush to get it going as quickly as possible. And that not only has to do with supply chain, I'd say it also has to do with the broader use of AI within a company. So that's what I'm talking about of how I was seeing it being leveraged and utilized and the growing ramp to do that as quickly as possible. It's using other functions within the company are trying to use HR is using it, compliance is using it, and that's typically research analysis, or it can be let's write that first draft of the report. It could be building a PowerPoint presentation for the business, presentation. It can look a lot of different ways, but all of a sudden when you start leveraging AI, are again there you're opening yourself up to who has access to it, how are they using it, what's the use case, and do we have those very strict guidelines around it, because that can open up a company as well that has nothing to do with supply chain, was how we could be someone who doesn't know how to use it properly, or they're putting sensitive proprietary, even cleared information into that presentation, into that report, investigative information, things that's protected, because they don't know how to use it properly and they're just to become more free with it. And so that is a big part of how the company needs to look at it too, not just specifically about the supply chain, but also how it's using more broadly within the corporation.
No, I think that's a great point, and it is. I mean, look, it is. We are at that time, right now, whereby we're trying to understand the true use cases of AI, as it relates to our data, as it relates to our platform, and everything else. But we also have to throw in a word of caution there to say, but there again, there has to be governance. There has to be some level of, to your point, guardrails around the use of that. And it's well versed in supply chain circles that, the biggest risk to supply chain over the next 3 to 5 years is probably going to be cyber. A cyber
Yeah,
attack is probably going to be one of the top risks to global supply chain. Does that ring
no
true with you as
question.
well?
Oh, no question at all. I have to agree. And having gone through a cyber incident at United, that was very impactful. You're absolutely right. That's kind of where we need to really bolster that protection and how we use it, know who has access, and all of those things that the cyber side would be looking to bolster and to strengthen. And you're absolutely right. You're spot on. It's becoming more and more. It's just easier, and
Right.
unfortunately, a lot of opportunities. It's an opportunity-rich environment, unfortunately.
So we've talked about the speed, we've talked about the pace, we've talked about not wanting to get left behind, and that's from a technology perspective, but also just from an operational perspective. There's a pressure to move quickly. There's a pressure to get going. How do today's supply chain leaders, how are they supposed to balance that speed with the operational demands, and then sound security controls to make sure that they are protected. What's your guidance on that?
Well, certainly to partner, right? Partner security is a great partner for this. How do we enable the business? Let's not, get overexcited or commit to this. Let's go get the fundamentals in place and find a balance between these are the fundamentals. These are why they matter. Let's go to the low hanging fruit. This is what we can do and put in place, and then go from there. I just think how they can strengthen and become is to look at first governance, make sure there's a balance between how the speed and how we're putting in place, being intentional about how we're moving forward and what capabilities we're looking for. I think the visibility, creating what that process of what that visibility looks like, who has clear ownership, who has accountability. So not passing that stuff up and say, as a function, you deal with that part, you deal with that. You've got to have that cross functional. Look at the compliance, legal, and other exposures if it's not done correctly, and then practical policy and guardrails. So those are clear that we have our employees trained in how to do that. That's very clear, usable direction in how to not use it and how to use it. What's the use case that we're after? So identifying that early on too, and the training I mentioned, and then finally resilience, planning ahead for if something goes wrong, what are we going to do about it? So it's almost like a business impact analysis and a business continuity plan with regard to that specifically. If something happens, what are we going to do? How do we react quickly and get back on track and moving forward? So the resilience part of this is critical as well. So the companies need to look at that holistically and create that cross-functional discussion. So we know do we know where our assets are? Do we know who's handling it? There's so many pieces of this, supply chain specific, of course, but also as our broader use of AI. So getting the fundamentals down in the same pace as they're incorporating use of AI and leveraging it for strategic purposes.
Right. And so, inevitably bad things are going to happen. When one of those bad things happen, there's always, and we've seen it over the last year with tariffs. We've seen it with the current crisis, whereby there's a sense of urgency and almost leads to a knee-jerk reaction. And my guidance, to our industry partners is always to look, hurry up and wait. Be very mindful of all of the moving parts, and don't automatically think that you have to make your next strategic decision right now. Sometimes it pays huge dividends to wait. So in that role, as you were, when you were the chief security officer, and you're advising, some of the biggest companies in the world still today, how do you relate that type of mentality to say a crisis will happen and there will be another problem, but the sun will most likely come up tomorrow. And in the meantime, you have to take a deep breath. Am I thinking about this in the right way, Tommy? Or are
I
you saying,
think you
oh
are.
God, Warreck's creating his own risk?
Well, one kind of like the backwards forwards, as I was mentioned, having a resilience plan with regard to when things go wrong. And so identifying what you're going to do, depending on what that is, with specificity to the AI. And if something goes wrong or something gets exposed, because again, and then on the front end is like, what? Don't, leaders need to reject the false choice between speed and security. So you can have a balance. Don't let urgency erase discipline. So those companies that are going to put those foundations in place, who are going to establish that, they're going to be way ahead of those others that are quickly leveraging it and maybe not understanding it fully, or realizing what the risks are along the way. So don't let your urgency to get there first erase the discipline that has to come with it. So I have seen that in other realms with regard to some of the roles I've been in other companies, like, oh, we really need to do this quickly. It's like, but you need some infrastructure in case this happens or that happens. So having a plan on the front end, but having the plan, something goes wrong, inevitably it will. What are we going to do and how are we going to manage that? And so you really need to focus on, and that's going to be somewhat of a, unique view and plan that you have to put in place. But it's really on the front end and then how you proceed, and visibility and accountability. Those are critical.
Okay. No, that makes sense. We did have one question pop up here. What type of training in AI do supply chain security professionals need to do? Any thoughts on that?
Some of that I think is understanding the tool you're putting in place and what its capabilities are. And then some of that certainly is going to be as you work in partnership with the AI vendor, having those discussions like what's it going to do? How do we limit access? How do we audit and understand? So it's going to be, I believe, some partnership with regard to that vendor and the AI and working against cross functionally. It's like, hey, supply chain function, here's where we want to use it. This is what this tool can do. How do you see what the risks are and really and what those exposures are, and then back to our AI vendor, how can we limit those? How we limit access? And so just tightening it up, but it's going to be cross functional, including the vendor say this is what the tool does. This is where we provide protections, and this is where you have visibility and accountability. So I think that training is going to be across multiple functions and the vendor to create what do we need to know about this and how do we limit that. We're going to have different views as functional leaders. Say, well, I'm concerned about the handoff, or I'm concerned about, hey, I'm going to give my entire legal team access to this tool to write the investigative report. It's like, well, maybe that's not the best idea. Maybe it's you have fewer access, and how do you audit how in fact they were using it, how they should not use it, and so forth. So it's going to, I think, span across all of that to create. I am not aware of any like AI type training except for from the legal compliance views, like this is what we gotta can't go in. But I'm not aware of any full offering of AI training and how to best protect. It's really gonna be that conversation across where is it being used, how's it being used, and how do we protect ourselves.
Right. And I think, I'm starting to see some use cases whereby, scenario planning can be very effective leveraging some of the new agentic models. I think that, there's still we should remember that, it's called co-pilot, not pilot. And this still requires a human in the loop. And I think that that human in the loop is going to be increasingly important on the decision making element of this. However, AI is going to start to enable us to do scenario planning at a level that we've never been able to do before, Tammy, which I think is actually a very positive thing.
I'm really glad you brought that up, David, because it really is. You cannot take the human element out of that. You have to remember that what you input into the AI tool is going to affect what your output is. And sometimes because of the speed and efficiency, people trust that that output, that's the way to do, or they rely on it to make the decision for them. And that's not what that should never be what there's always got to be a human element. It does always has to be human overview and human decision making. It's supposed to be a tool that helps them, but not make the decision, and remembering that, just echoing what you just said, it's like it's human, it's a tool for decision making, but it should not be making the decision, and remembering that human element as part of partnership with I think it is critical.
No, I absolutely love that. I mean, it has been an absolute pleasure. We could seriously talk all day. There's so many different avenues we could go down here. I really, really appreciate you taking the time to spend with me today. Thank you so much for answering all of the questions. This is just a fundamental topic. I think that, this gold rush is real. It's really happening right now. The industry has to be prepared. The industry has to be thoughtful about how we show up as a supply chain, as a global supply chain. And I think that, some of the guidance and advice that you've given here today, because of where you've sat in the industry and because of the advice and the responsibilities that you've had to deal with over time, it's just incredible. So really, thank you so much for taking the time.
I so appreciate the opportunity. Really enjoyed our discussion. Thank you very much. I think AI is where we are going, and I think it is a huge business advantage. But everything we talked about today is like that cautionary, intentional, like you said. I look forward to see what it'll look like in a year or two. So thank you for the time, and thanks for the opportunity to talk with you today.
Wonderful. Thanks everybody for listening. And we hope you enjoyed this. If you did, please give us a thumbs up and send us some comments. If you want us to talk about it in a different way, please let us know and we will try and accommodate. Thank you so much for listening.